7 hungry mouths, 7 pairs of hollow eyes. The men of Bitter Creek laughed, spitting tobacco at the widow's feet, calling her a ruined plot of land. Ethan didn't want a wife. He damn sure didn't want a tribe. But his mouth opened anyway. "I'll take 'em all." Ethan Cobb chewed the inside of his cheek until the flesh tasted like copper. The wind howling off the Colorado plains carried the scent of dry rot, mule sweat, and stale beer, kicking grit into the eyes of every miserable soul gathered in front of the Bitter Creek Mercantile. It was a Tuesday, Wife Day, the locals called it. The heavy wagon from St. Joseph had rolled in an hour past dawn, its wooden axles groaning under the weight of desperate women and misplaced hope. Ethan leaned his shoulder against a splintered hitching post, thumbing a shaved piece of pine. He'd come down from the high ridges for salt, black powder, and maybe a quiet woman to keep his cabin from feeling like a coffin come December. Not that he'd ever confessed that aloud. He told himself he just needed someone to mend his wool shirts and keep the fire stoked while he ran the trap lines. A man in a greasy bowler hat stood on a crate, shouting over the wind. The women stood in a line on the boardwalk. Some stared a hole into the toes of their boots. Some glared right back at the miners and ranchers who were eyeing them like spring calves at a livestock swap. Then there was the widow, Cora. That was the name scrawled on a piece of paper pinned to her faded calico bodice. She wasn't beautiful. Not in the way the men with freshly panned gold in their pockets were looking for. Her face was weathered, the skin pulled tight around a sharp jaw, and her dark eyes held the flat, hard look of a woman who had buried a husband and didn't have tears left to waste on a new one. Her dress was frayed at the cuffs, stained with old dirt that no amount of lye soap could strip away. But it wasn't her weathered face that kept the men laughing. It was the steps behind her. 7 of them. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, a boy with shoulders too broad for his starved, bony frame. The youngest was a bundle of gray rags strapped to Cora's chest. In between were 5 others, huddled together like quail caught in a winter storm. They smelled of unwashed hair and poverty. "What's the bid on the whole litter?" a voice yelled from the back of the crowd. A chorus of crude, hacking laughter followed. "Ain't no man got enough grain to feed that herd," another rancher chimed in, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "She better be good at pulling a plow." Ethan didn't laugh. He felt a dull, pounding ache behind his eyes. He hated the noise of the town. He hated these men who smelled like cheap whiskey and unwashed wool, making a joke out of starving children. But he wasn't a hero. He was a man who preferred the company of lodgepole pines because they didn't talk back. He liked his silence. He liked his solitude. He looked at Cora. She didn't flinch. Her hands, red and heavily chapped, rested on the narrow shoulders of the 2 children nearest her. Her jaw was set so hard Ethan thought he could hear the bone grinding from 10 feet away. She was terrified. He could tell by the rapid rise and fall of her chest. But she was entirely unbroken. All right, the agent barked, waving a leather-bound ledger to quiet the crowd. "Mrs. Miller here is a proven hard worker, but we understand the burden. The boys can go to the iron foundry up in Denver. The girls can be placed with proper Christian families. We can separate." No, the word wasn't loud, but it cut through the wind like a rusted knife. Cora stepped forward. The sudden movement startled the agent, causing him to drop his ledger. "Ma'am, you ain't in a position to negotiate." I said no. Her voice was entirely devoid of a tremble. "My children stay with me." The crowd groaned. A man in a canvas coat spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Then you'll starve together, widow. Ain't no man taking on another man's 8 mistakes." Ethan watched Cora's shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. It was the microscopic collapse of a woman hitting the absolute end of her rope. She looked down at the infant on her chest, then back to the 12-year-old boy. The boy swallowed hard, pushing his chest out, trying to look brave for his mother. Ethan's own chest tightened. "Turn around," he told himself. "Go buy the salt. Go back to the mountain." A quiet woman. That was the plan. Not a walking orphanage. He snapped the pine stick in his hand. The crack was sharp. He didn't plan the words. He didn't even weigh them. They just spilled out of him, rough, low, and laced with heavy annoyance. "I'll take her." The crowd went dead quiet. The wind rattled a loose board on the mercantile. The agent blinked, adjusting his bowler hat. "Mr. Cobb? You bidding on the widow?" Did I stutter? Ethan pushed off the hitching post. His knees popped. "Ethan, you're out of your damn mind," muttered a trapper standing nearby, his breath reeking of onions. "That's 7 kids. You'll be eating pine cones by January." Ethan ignored him. He walked through the crowd. Men stepped aside. Ethan wasn't a towering man, but he was wire-tight, scarred, and carried a heavy Henry rifle over his shoulder like it was a part of his own skeleton. He smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and cold iron, a stark contrast to the stale sweat of the settlement. He stopped in front of the wooden platform. Up close, he could see the premature gray streaks in Cora's dark braids. He could smell the sour milk on her collar and the deep dust baked into her skin. She looked down at him. Suspicion radiated from her like heat off a cast-iron stove. "I'll take her," Ethan repeated to the agent, keeping his eyes on Cora and all 7 of her children. The silence dragged out, heavy and thick. Ethan felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea at what he was committing to. $5, the agent finally squeaked, finding his voice. Ethan fished a crumpled gold eagle coin from his heavy canvas pocket and tossed it onto the crate. It rang loud against the wood. He looked at Cora again. She was staring at him like he was a rattlesnake coiled at her feet. "Get your things in the wagon," Ethan said, his voice flat. "The one with the canvas topped by the livery. We leave in 20 minutes. He turned and walked away before she could say a word. He didn't want her gratitude. He wasn't even sure he wanted her. As he walked toward the mercantile to buy 3 times the flour he had planned on, a sickening wave of regret washed over him. 7. He had a one-room cabin. The ride out of Bitter Creek was suffocating. Ethan sat on the buckboard, the thick leather reins loose in his calloused hands. The rhythmic clop of the mules, usually a sound that brought him a deep, meditative peace, was entirely drowned out by a cacophony of sniffles, shifting bodies, and the occasional sharp whisper from Cora telling someone to sit still. His wagon wasn't built for passengers. It was built for animal pelts, sacks of beans, and rusted traps. Now, it was a rolling sea of sharp elbows, dirty knees, and thin, moth-eaten blankets. He glanced over his shoulder. Cora sat directly behind him, stiff as a fresh corpse. She had the infant tightly clutched to her chest. The 12-year-old, whose name Ethan hadn't bothered to ask, was glaring at the back of Ethan's neck like he expected the mountain man to pull over and slaughter them all in the dirt. Ethan pulled his wide-brimmed hat lower against the harsh setting sun. The light hit the dust, kicked up by the iron-rimmed wheels, turning the air bronze and gritty. He tasted dirt on his teeth. He spat over the side of the wagon. What had he done? The sheer panic of his own impulse gnawed at the lining of his stomach. The mountain was unforgiving. It didn't care about orphans or noble deeds. Winter was 6 weeks away. He barely had enough cured venison for himself, let alone 8 extra stomachs. As the wagon hit a rut, he mentally calculated his stores. 50 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of coffee, a few bushels of root vegetables in the cellar. It wasn't enough. He'd have to hunt through the deep freezes. He'd have to work himself to the bone just to keep these strangers breathing. His grip on the reins tightened until his knuckles went white. He could turn back. It was only 3 miles. He could dump them at the mission church, leave a $20 gold piece, and wash his hands of the whole mess. "We aren't a charity case." Her voice was close, just over his left shoulder. It was raspy, dry as dead leaves. Ethan didn't turn around. "Didn't say you were. You look like a man trying to figure out how to unbuy a lame horse," Cora said. Her tone was defensive, sharp enough to cut glass. He let out a short, humorless breath through his nose. He liked that she wasn't weeping. He hated weeping women. Tears were just water wasted. "I ain't a rich man, Mrs. Miller. I live at 8,000 feet. The snow gets high enough to bury this wagon by Christmas. It ain't a place for soft people. My children aren't soft." Ethan finally looked back over his shoulder. He caught her eye. She wasn't backing down. The evening wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. "We'll see," he grunted, turning his attention back to the road. The strained silence stretched for another mile. The sun dipped below the jagged, snow-capped teeth of the Rockies, pulling long, bruised shadows across the plains. The air snapped cold, almost instantly. Right on cue, the coughing started in the back of the wagon. A wet, rattling sound from one of the smaller girls. Ethan winced. The sound dug under his skin. He reached under his wooden seat, his hand brushing past a coil of hemp rope and a box of rifle shells, until his rough fingers closed over a heavy, wool Hudson Bay blanket. It smelled faintly of wet dog and old axle grease. Without turning around, he shoved it backward over the bench. For a second, nobody took it. Ethan's arm hovered awkwardly in the cold air, his muscles tensing with irritation. Then, he felt a tug. Cora pulled the heavy wool back into the bed of the wagon. "Wrap the little ones," he said gruffly. He heard the heavy rustle of the fabric, followed by a hushed, sharp command, from Cora to one of the middle girls, to tuck her bare feet in. It was pitch black by the time they reached the foothills. The trail narrowed, pitching sharply upward into the dense pines. The smell shifted completely from the dry dust and sage of the plains to the sharp resin, damp earth, and decaying pine needles of the high country. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees. "Pa?" The word was small, terrified. It came from the darkness of the wagon bed. Ethan flinched, as if a hot ember had been dropped down his shirt. He yanked the reins, pulling the mules to an abrupt, jarring halt. The wooden wagon groaned in protest. He turned all the way around on the bench. In the gloom, he could barely make out the faces, just the pale ovals of their eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. It was a little boy, maybe 5 years old, clutching the edge of a flour sack, staring up at him. Ethan's chest felt strangely tight, not with affection, with absolute panic. "I ain't your pa," Ethan said, his voice harsher and louder than he intended. It echoed off the dark trees. "My name is Ethan. You call me Ethan, or Mr. Cobb. You understand?" The little boy shrank back instantly, burying his face in Cora's side. Before Ethan could turn back around, Cora's hand shot out. She grabbed the collar of Ethan's thick canvas coat. Her grip was startlingly strong. She pulled him a fraction of an inch closer, leaning over the bench until her face was inches from his in the dark. "Do not bark at them," she hissed. Her breath smelled of stale biscuits, but there was a fierce, feral heat behind her words that made Ethan freeze. "You bought my hand, Mr. Cobb. You bought my labor. But you do not own their spirits. You frighten him again, and I'll take a rock to your head while you sleep." Ethan stared at her. He could see the whites of her eyes, wide and terrified, masking the violent threat. She was shaking, not from the freezing mountain air, but from adrenaline. She fully expected him to hit her. A normal man would have slapped her away. A normal man would have reminded her, violently, that she was his property by law. Ethan slowly reached up, his thick, calloused fingers wrapped around her small, shaking hand. He didn't squeeze it. He didn't bend her wrist. He just gently peeled her fingers off his coat and moved her hand away. "You won't need a rock," he said quietly, his voice dropping its edge. "Just keep 'em quiet. The mules get skittish on this steep grade." He turned back around, slapped the leather reins over the mules' rumps, and the wagon lurched forward up the trail. As they climbed higher into the black teeth of the mountains, Ethan felt the bizarre, terrifying sensation of his life fracturing. The deep, heavy silence he had cultivated for 10 years was gone forever. Behind him was a symphony of shivering bodies, nervous breathing, and the rustling of a woman who was mentally preparing to murder him if necessary. He rubbed his stubbled jaw, feeling the cold wind bite into his cheeks. It was going to be a long winter. The mules finally stopped, their massive sides heaving, blowing hot plumes of steam into the freezing dark. Ethan wrapped the reins around the iron brake lever. He didn't speak. He just dropped down from the buckboard, his boots crunching loudly in the frosted mud, and walked toward the dark silhouette of the cabin. It sat tucked beneath a massive overhang of granite, a 12 by 16 box of rough-hewn pine logs packed with dried mud. It looked like a rotting stump in the moonlight. Behind him, he heard the creak of the wagon bed and the soft, urgent whispers of Cora, hurrying her children out into the biting wind. Ethan kicked the cabin door open. It whined on leather hinges. The air inside was 10 degrees colder than outside, smelling heavily of stale ash, cured tobacco, and old bacon grease. It was the smell of a man who lived completely alone. He struck a sulfur match against the doorframe. The sharp, chemical sting flared in his nostrils. He lit the oil lamp hanging from the center beam, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cramped space. One iron stove, one rough table, one narrow cot tucked into the far corner, covered in a ragged bear hide. That was it. Ethan turned. Cora stood in the doorway. She held the infant tight against her neck, the worn blanket wrapped over both of them. Behind her, the 6 other children crowded together, their eyes wide and terrified, taking in the dismal reality of their new life. The 5-year-old boy had his thumb wedged firmly in his mouth. The older girls were shivering so hard their teeth were audibly clicking. The 12-year-old boy, whose name Ethan still hadn't asked, stepped in front of his mother. His hands were balled into tight, trembling fists at his sides. He looked at the single, narrow bed, then up at Ethan, his jaw set in a pathetic but fierce imitation of a man. Ethan felt that dull ache behind his eyes again. The walls felt like they were shrinking. 9 people, in a space built for one. He suddenly couldn't breathe. He needed to be outside. He needed the empty air. "Get them inside," Ethan muttered, pushing past Cora onto the porch. "Close the door. Keep the draft out." He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He walked to the woodpile, grabbed an armful of split cedar, and carried it back in. He dumped it violently next to the iron stove. The loud clatter made the smaller girls jump. "I need water," Cora said. Ethan paused, his hand on the stove's iron latch. He looked back at her. She had already set the baby on the bear hide and was unbuttoning her threadbare coat. There was no hesitation in her movements, no paralyzed grief. Just a grim, mechanical drive to survive. "There's a pump out back. It's frozen. You'll have to break the ice." Ethan pointed to a rusted tin bucket near the door. Cora didn't ask for help. She grabbed the bucket and walked out into the freezing night. The door slammed shut behind her. Ethan knelt and built the fire, the dry cedar catching quickly, the smoke drawing up the iron pipe. The heat began to radiate, bringing a heavy, damp smell out of the children's unwashed clothes. It smelled like wet sheep and old dirt. Ethan hated it. His stomach churned with a sudden selfish rage at the loss of his sanctuary. The door opened. Cora returned, her face flushed red from the cold, lugging the heavy bucket of sloshing, freezing water. She dropped it on the stove, her knuckles white and scraped raw from breaking the ice. "Where is the flour?" she asked. "Bin under the table. Salt? Shelf. Coffee? Ain't for kids." "It is tonight," Cora said flatly. She didn't look at him. She was already digging her cracked hands into the flour bin. "They're frozen through. Hot water and flour won't warm their blood. They need the heat." Ethan ground his teeth, but he didn't argue. He watched her work. She was fast, brutally efficient. Within 20 minutes, a thick, tasteless slurry of flour, water, and bacon fat was boiling on the stove, alongside a tin pot of harsh black coffee. She fed the children first. They ate like wild dogs, scraping the bottoms of the tin bowls with their fingers, too exhausted and starved to care about the taste. Ethan stood by the door, watching the food he had carefully rationed for February disappear in minutes. When the bowls were empty, the heavy weight of exhaustion hit the children like a physical blow. They began to slump against the floorboards. "Put 'em on the bed," Ethan said. Cora stopped scrubbing a bowl. She looked at the narrow cot, then at him. "All of them? Pile 'em in sideways. They'll fit. Body heat will keep 'em alive." "And you?" she asked, her voice tight with renewed suspicion. Ethan walked to the corner and grabbed a heavy canvas tarp and a buffalo robe. He threw them on the hard dirt floor near the stove. "I sleep where I sleep." Cora watched him for a long, heavy moment. The suspicion didn't leave her eyes, but a flicker of something else, confusion, maybe crossed her face. She turned away, quietly ushering her brood toward the cot. The 12-year-old boy didn't move. He stood near the door, glaring at Ethan. "Your name?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "Amos," the boy spat out. "Well, Amos, you can stand there and freeze, or you can get under the bear hide with your sisters." "I ain't sleeping in your bed." Ethan let out a tired sigh. He tossed a spare wool blanket at the boy's feet. "Suit yourself. Floor's cold. Don't come crying when your toes turn black." Ethan lay down on the buffalo robe, turning his back to the room. The fire popped and hissed. For an hour he lay there, his muscles tight, listening to the cacophony of shallow breathing, coughs, and the shifting of 8 bodies. It was maddening. Just as he was drifting into a shallow, irritated sleep, he felt a slight pressure on his back. A heavy wool blanket had been draped over his canvas coat. He didn't turn around. He just listened to the soft, barefoot footsteps of the widow walking back to the cot. Winter hit 3 weeks later, burying the cabin under 4 feet of dead silent, blinding white snow. The silence outside was absolute. The noise inside was a living, breathing monster. Ethan felt like a rat trapped in a jar. The air in the cabin was constantly thick with the smell of boiling diapers, wet wool, and wood smoke. He spent every daylight hour outside, running his trap lines until his fingers bled from the cold iron, purely to avoid the suffocating heat and noise of the shack. He was hunting relentlessly. The flour was half gone. The coffee was a memory. They were living on dried beans and stringy rabbit meat. Ethan was losing weight, his ribs pressing sharply against his skin, pushing his body to the brink just to keep the 7 gaping mouths fed. He never complained. He just worked in grim, furious silence. Cora matched his silence. She worked the cabin with a violent intensity. She scrubbed the floorboards with sand. She mended Ethan's torn heavy socks, her fingers flying over the wool in the dim lamplight. She kept the children out of his way. Whenever Ethan stepped through the door, dropping a frozen hair or a handful of meager root vegetables on the table, the kids scattered to the edges of the room like flushed quail. It was a cold, transactional existence. Until the Tuesday he brought down the elk. It had taken him 6 hours to track the massive bull through chest-deep drifts. When he finally dropped it with a single shot behind the shoulder, he was 5 miles from the cabin. By the time he dragged the gutted, steaming carcass back to the clearing, his muscles were screaming, his lungs burning with the metallic taste of cold blood and exhaustion. He dropped the drag rope in the snow just outside the door and collapsed onto the porch steps. His vision swam with black spots. He sat there, his head hanging between his knees, gasping for air. The cabin door opened. Ethan looked up. Cora stood there, a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked past him to the massive, bloody carcass bleeding out into the pristine white snow. Ethan waited for her to flinch. Most women he knew would have turned away from the sheer volume of blood, the raw, brutal reality of survival. Cora didn't flinch. She stared at the mountain of meat, her flat, dark eyes calculating. She turned back into the cabin. A moment later, she emerged carrying 2 large tin buckets and Ethan's heavy, steel-bladed skinning knife. She walked down the steps, her worn boots sinking deep into the bloody snow. She knelt beside the elk. She didn't look at him. She just hiked up her faded skirts, tucked them into her belt, and drove the knife into the hide. Ethan watched, stunned. Her hands were raw, split, and red from washing clothes in freezing water. But they moved with a brutal, practiced efficiency. She pulled the heavy hide back, slicing through the silver membrane with the skill of a seasoned butcher. Her forearms were quickly coated in thick, dark blood. Steam rose from the hot meat, curling around her face. She worked in complete silence. The only sounds were the wet tear of flesh, the scrape of the blade against bone, and the whistling wind. Ethan forced himself up. His legs felt like lead. He walked over, drew his smaller boning knife, and knelt on the opposite side of the carcass. They worked together for 2 hours in the freezing cold. They didn't speak a single word. They fell into an unspoken rhythm. He would pry the heavy joints apart. She would slice the meat clean. They filled both buckets, then fetched a canvas tarp to load the rest. By the time they hauled the last quarter of meat into the icy root cellar beneath the floorboards, it was pitch black outside. Ethan stood by the wood stove, washing the drying blood off his hands in a tin basin. The water turned a murky rust color. His back was agonizingly stiff. He grabbed a towel and turned around. Cora was sitting at the rough wooden table. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a tin mug of hot water. Her face was smeared with dried blood and soot. She looked exhausted. utterly, fundamentally broken down by the sheer weight of keeping her children alive. Ethan walked to the shelf. He reached behind a stack of rusted traps and pulled out a small circular tin. He walked over to the table and set it down in front of her. It hit the wood with a quiet clack. Cora looked up at him, her dark eyes narrowing slightly. "Bear tallow and mint," Ethan muttered, looking away, suddenly feeling foolish. He rubbed the back of his neck. "For your hands. They're cracking open." He turned and walked toward his buffalo robe on the floor. He didn't see her open the tin. But as he lay in the dark, listening to the wind howling against the pine logs, the sharp, clean scent of mint cut through the smell of damp wool and wood smoke. "Thank you." The whisper was so quiet he almost didn't hear it over the crackle of the stove. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't sharp. It was just a tired, genuine surrender. Ethan closed his eyes. The cabin was loud. There were 8 other people breathing in his space. But for the first time in 10 years, as the snow buried the world outside, the noise didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a heartbeat. If Ethan and Cora's story struck a chord with you, don't let their journey end here. Hit that like button if you want to see how this makeshift family survives the brutal winter. Make sure to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chapter of this rugged mountain saga. Got a favorite moment so far? Drop it in the comments below and share this video with someone who loves a truly gritty, raw, Western romance.